What happens when cruelty backfires and reveals a brilliance no one expected? At Westridge High School, Principal Veronica Stevens thought she was orchestrating a public humiliation when she forced Johnson Williams, a quiet black student, to perform a violin solo in front of the entire school. All as a joke. She never imagined she was unlocking a legacy of talent hidden deep within his bloodline. With a battered body and wounded pride, Johnson stood at the crossroads of humiliation and discovery. And what unfolded next would not only shatter every expectation, but would also forever change the way the school viewed strength, talent, and dignity. Dear viewer, this is not just a story about music or revenge. It's a story about resilience, hidden gifts, and the unstoppable power of self-belief. Before we dive into this incredible journey, comment below where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more powerful stories like this. The air inside the Westridge High Auditorium was thick with restless energy as hundreds of students sat in assembly, awaiting the principal's usual morning speech. Among them, Johnson Williams leaned quietly against the back wall, trying not to draw attention to himself. But his tall frame, combined with his unwillingness to sit, made him an easy target for Principal Veronica Stevens' sharp, predatory gaze. "Mr. Williams," she barked from the stage microphone, her voice slicing through the murmuring crowd. "Why are you not seated with your peers?" Johnson straightened slightly, wincing at the pain in his back. "I can't sit right now, Principal Stevens," he said, his voice respectful but strained. Her eyes narrowed. "Can't or won't?" The assembly, sensing drama, leaned in. Veronica Stevens relished moments like this. Public discipline was her weapon of choice. She began to stride through the crowd, her heels clacking ominously against the hardwood floor, each step building the tension higher. Johnson could feel hundreds of eyes on him. "My back's hurting real bad, ma'am," he mumbled, hoping to avoid further spectacle. But Principal Stevens wasn't interested in compassion. She was interested in control. "No excuses," she declared loudly. "When we gather as a school, we adhere to the same expectations. No exceptions." Aisha, Johnson's best friend seated a few rows forward, turned around with wide, worried eyes. She knew what the others didn't. She knew about the bruises hidden under Johnson's shirt, knew about yesterday's incident in Ms. Reynolds's class that had left him injured and humiliated. She knew this wasn't just teenage rebellion. Principal Stevens' sharp gaze noticed something by Johnson's feet, a violin case, clearly out of place next to a student not known for any musical prowess. She smirked, sensing an opportunity for an even more satisfying display of power. "And what is this?" she sneered, tapping the case with the pointed toe of her stiletto. "It's Aisha's violin, ma'am," Johnson explained quickly. "I'm just holding it for her until orchestra practice." The smirk deepened into a full-blown malicious grin. "Oh, really?" she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Since you seem so fond of bending the rules and making up stories, perhaps you'd like to show us all your hidden musical talents." Before Johnson could object, Principal Stevens snatched up the violin case and thrust it into his arms. "You'll be performing at next Friday's spring concert," she announced to the crowd, her voice ringing triumphantly through the auditorium. "A solo. 3 minutes minimum." The room erupted in laughter. Some students hooted. Others simply exchanged amused glances. Everyone knew Johnson had no training, no musical background. This was clearly intended as a punishment, a stage humiliation. "I don't play," Johnson protested softly, but Principal Stevens waved him off. "Then I suggest you learn quickly," she said, her voice cruelly sweet. "Unless you'd prefer detention for the rest of the semester for insubordination." Johnson's face burned with humiliation as he clutched the violin case. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried not just wood and strings, but all the mocking stares and whispers of the auditorium. Principal Stevens turned away, utterly pleased with herself. "Let this be a lesson to everyone about the importance of respect," she said to the microphone, her words thudding into the hushed air like stones. As the assembly dismissed, Aisha rushed to Johnson's side, her face tight with anger. "She can't do that to you," Aisha whispered fiercely. "She just did," Johnson muttered back, voice hollow. A painful memory surfaced. Yesterday's English class. Ms. Reynolds, his strict and dismissive English teacher, had shoved him into a broken chair when he pointed out its jagged metal protrusion. The sharp piece had ripped through his shirt and scratched deeply into his back. Blood had trickled down under his clothes, unseen by the others. And when he had tried to protest, detention, a lecture on disrupting the learning environment, and now another public punishment, another humiliation dressed up as discipline. No one had stood up for him then. No one was standing up for him now. As students streamed out into the hallways, Johnson remained frozen for a moment, gripping the violin case so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced. He had never touched a violin in his life. The very idea of performing in front of the entire school, of standing under that crushing, judgmental gaze again, made his stomach twist with dread. "I'll help you," Aisha said firmly. Johnson turned to her, startled. "I've been playing since I was 6, she said. "We have 10 days. It's not much, but it's enough to do something." He shook his head hopelessly. "She wants me to fail. That's the whole point." Aisha placed her hand on his arm. "Then we won't give her what she wants." And in that simple moment, standing in a sea of indifference, bruised, humiliated, holding an instrument he couldn't play, a decision began to form in Johnson's heart. Not for revenge, not for approval, but for something deeper, something that would take 10 brutal, transformative days to fully awaken. 10 days to turn a weapon of humiliation into a triumph no one would ever forget. That night, Johnson sat at the kitchen table, the borrowed violin case unopened before him like a silent accusation. Every muscle in his body ached from a day spent dodging mockery and pressure, but the worst pain was the one gnawing inside his chest. The familiar certainty that no matter how hard he tried, he was being set up to fail. His mother, Mrs. Williams, moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner after her long double shift at the hospital. She stole worried glances at Johnson, sensing the storm churning beneath his silence. "You haven't told me what happened today," she finally said, placing a plate in front of him. Johnson stared at the violin case. The words felt heavy on his tongue, but they tumbled out anyway. He told her about the assembly, about Principal Stevens's sneer, about the special performance that everyone knew was meant to be a public execution. Mrs. Williams listened in tight-lipped silence, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. When Johnson finished, she sat down across from him, her voice low and firm. "My boy," she said, "there are 2 ways to handle people like Principal Stevens and Miss Reynolds. You can let them break you, or you can rise so far above them, they have to crane their necks just to see you." She nodded toward the unopened violin case. "Which will it be?" "Mama, I can't," Johnson whispered. 10 days, it's impossible." "Nothing's impossible for a Williams," she said, fire igniting in her eyes. "Your grandfather couldn't read until he was 30. Your father taught himself music from nothing, after 12-hour shifts hauling freight." Johnson's head jerked up. "Dad played music?" Mrs. Williams's expression softened. She stood and retrieved an old worn photo album from the living room. Flipping through the pages, she found the photo she sought. A young, smiling black man cradling a battered violin in his hands. "He had natural talent," she said softly, "but he had to give it up. Life made different demands." Johnson touched the photo reverently. It was the first time he had seen his father connected to anything like music, like artistry, like a dream deferred. "You have the chance your father never got," Mrs. Williams said, "even if it came from someone trying to humiliate you." Johnson's phone buzzed. "Aisha, have you opened the case yet? I can come over tonight and help you get started." He hesitated. "You're not alone, baby," his mother said, nodding at the phone. "Let her come." An hour later, Aisha arrived, a backpack full of sheet music and a determination in her eyes that Johnson had rarely seen before. "First," she said, carefully opening the violin case, "we learn how to hold it." The moment Johnson rested the violin under his chin, he winced. His back throbbed in protest, the injury from Ms. Reynolds' attack refusing to be ignored. "This is hopeless," he muttered, trying to adjust his posture. "Not hopeless," Aisha corrected him sharply. "Challenging. There's a difference, and you're not doing this alone." Patiently, she guided his hands, his fingers. He scratched out a few pitiful sounds. They both winced. "It's supposed to sound like that at first," Aisha reassured him. smiling despite the noise. Even I sounded like dying cats when I started. For hours they worked at it, bowing simple open strings, learning to shift his weight to spare his aching back, building calluses on fingertips that had never touched a string before. Mrs. Williams watched them quietly from the kitchen doorway, her heart swelling with pride and fear. She knew the odds were nearly impossible, but she also knew the stubborn fire that ran in her son's blood. When Aisha finally left, Johnson sat alone at the table again, violin in hand, the apartment dark around him except for the kitchen light. He lifted the bow and dragged it across the strings once more. A screech, yes, but slightly less hideous than before. He thought about Principal Stevens's smirk, about Miss Reynolds's contempt, about the way the auditorium had buzzed with laughter at his expense. He thought about his father's lost dream, about the calloused hands that had once held a violin the way Johnson was holding it now. Number, they weren't going to win this time. "I'm not doing this for you," he whispered to the violin. "I'm doing this for me." And with that vow, Johnson set the bow to the strings again, and again, and again, determined to turn 10 days of mockery into a moment none of them would ever forget. For the next 3 days, Johnson pushed himself harder than he had ever pushed before. Every morning he woke at 5 a.m., his back stiff and aching, to practice simple scales and bow exercises before school. Every lunch break, while his classmates gossiped and scrolled their phones, Johnson would slip into the empty science lab, hunched awkwardly over the violin, coaxing awkward sounds from the strings. Mr. Patel, the chemistry teacher, had noticed him lurking by the lab doors on the second day. "Need a place to practice?" he asked, smiling kindly. Johnson nodded. Mr. Patel handed him a key. "Just don't blow anything up." Despite the joke, Johnson could see the understanding in the teacher's eyes, the rare, precious understanding that made a lifeline feel like a small miracle. But practicing was a brutal war. Every movement hurt. His fingers blistered and cracked. The violin felt alien in his hands, stubborn and slippery. Most of the time, the noises he produced sounded like wounded cats or shrieking hinges. Sometimes he wanted to smash the thing into the wall and be done with it. But every time frustration built up to that breaking point, he remembered his mother's face. Proud, fierce. He remembered the photograph of his father cradling that old violin. He remembered Aisha's firm voice, not hopeless, challenging. And so he kept playing. After school each day, he would meet Aisha for another crash course session. She drilled him relentlessly but kindly, focusing on one small skill at a time. How to draw the bow evenly, how to find the right pressure on the strings, how to correct his wrist angle. "Slow is smooth," she said, repeating the mantra every time he rushed and fumbled. "And smooth is fast." By the third day, a small miracle happened. Johnson managed to play the first 8 bars of the simple piece they had chosen, a beginner's arrangement of Ode to Joy. The notes were slow, uneven, and occasionally squeaky, but they were recognizable. They were music. Johnson dropped his arms in exhaustion and disbelief after the final note. Aisha clapped her hands, grinning so wide her face hurt. "You did it!" she cried. "I did," Johnson said, blinking like he'd woken from a dream. "You played a real song," Aisha said. "Not perfectly, not fast, but you played it." He slumped into the nearest chair, laughter bubbling out of him. The first real laughter he'd felt since the whole nightmare with Principal Stevens began. But the victory was short-lived. That night, Johnson discovered something worse than the pain, worse than the exhaustion: doubt. Lying awake in bed, his body aching, he thought about what lay ahead. Not a private recital in front of a few friends, a public performance in front of the entire school and the school board, and Principal Stevens, who was waiting, eagerly, for him to fail. "This isn't enough," the dark voice in his mind whispered. "You're just fooling yourself. They'll still laugh. They'll still crush you." He almost texted Aisha to say he was giving up. Almost called Mr. Carter, the music teacher, to tell him it was a lost cause. Almost told his mother he would just accept the detention after all. But somehow he didn't. Instead, Johnson dragged himself out of bed, tiptoed to the living room, and retrieved the violin. In the soft darkness, under the dim light of the kitchen, He played the 8 bars again, slowly, carefully. Ode to Joy had never sounded so broken, but it had also never sounded so beautiful. Because it was his. He played it 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, until the notes fell into place like pebbles settling into a riverbed. By the time he finally allowed himself to collapse back into bed, something had shifted inside him. Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe it wouldn't be perfect. Maybe they would still laugh. But for once, that didn't matter. He was doing this not because they demanded it, not even to prove them wrong anymore. He was doing it because somewhere, deep inside, a seed had been planted. A belief that maybe he was capable of more than surviving humiliation. Maybe he was capable of something beautiful. On the 4th afternoon, after a particularly grueling lunch practice session, Johnson wandered the deserted music wing, violin case dangling from his aching fingers. His usual hideout, the science lab, was locked and the courtyard was crowded with noisy soccer players. Desperate for a place to practice, he tried the heavy wooden door of the music room. To his surprise, it swung open. Inside, Mr. Carter, the school's music teacher, was stacking sheet music onto the piano. "Lost, Mr. Williams?" Mr. Carter asked, arching an eyebrow. Johnson flushed. "No, sir. I needed a place to practice." Mr. Carter studied him for a long moment. "Practice?" He set down the music and motioned Johnson forward. "Let's hear it." Johnson hesitated. His hands were clammy. His heart pounded in his ears. But something in Mr. Carter's patient gaze gave him courage. He positioned the violin under his chin, imperfectly, still awkward, and began to play the few bars of Ode to Joy he had painstakingly learned. The first few notes squawked. His bow wobbled, but he fought through the mistakes, finishing the phrase without stopping. Silence stretched in the room. Mr. Carter rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Rough, but surprising." Johnson lowered the violin, bracing for criticism. "Where did you learn?" Mr. Carter asked. "Aisha's been helping me," Johnson said. "Principal Stevens made me perform for the spring concert." Mr. Carter's eyes darkened. "Ah, yes, I heard something about that." He leaned against the piano, regarding Johnson with a new kind of intensity. "You've been playing, what? A few days?" "4," Johnson said. Mr. Carter shook his head slowly, as if struggling to believe it. "And you can already stumble through a melody by ear." "I guess," Johnson muttered. "You guess?" Mr. Carter smiled faintly. "You have a gift, Johnson. Raw, unpolished, but real." Johnson blinked, stunned. Nobody, not Principal Stevens, not Ms. Reynolds, not even himself, had ever used that word about him before. Gift. Mr. Carter pushed off the piano. "Listen, I don't have much authority here, but if you want it, if you really want it, I can help you. At least enough to get through that concert without being torn apart." "Help? How?" Johnson asked cautiously. "Real practice, real techniques, not just scrambling to memorize one piece. Learning how to hold yourself, how to think musically." Johnson hesitated. Was it even possible to cram real musical training into 6 days? Then he thought about Principal Stevens sneering at him in front of the whole school. He thought about Miss Reynolds shoving him onto that broken chair. He thought about the picture of his father with the violin, smiling as if the world had not yet broken him. "Okay," he said, "teach me." Mr. Carter's smile widened, not with amusement, but with a kind of grim respect. "Good," he said, "but I'm warning you, it won't be easy." "I don't care," Johnson said, surprising himself with the force of it. "I'll do whatever it takes." And so began a secret pact between the fallen student and the disillusioned teacher. Every afternoon after the last bell, Johnson met Mr. Carter in the music room. The sessions were brutal. Mr. Carter stripped away Johnson's sloppy bowholds, his hunched posture, his panicked scrambles through the music. He made Johnson practice open strings for an hour before even thinking about touching a melody. He forced him to slow down, to focus on tone before speed. "You can't rush music," Mr. Carter said again and again. "You have to feel your way through it." Some nights Johnson's back pain was so intense he could barely climb into bed. But still, every morning, he woke up early and practiced again. Slowly, imperceptibly, something shifted. The sounds he made were still imperfect, still raw, but beneath the imperfections, a kind of music was starting to breathe, a kind of hymn. On the sixth day, as Johnson struggled through a particularly tricky phrase, Mr. Carter stopped him with a raised hand. "Do you know why Principal Stevens set you up like this?" he asked quietly. "Because she hates me," Johnson said bluntly. Mr. Carter shook his head. "Number, because she's afraid of you." Johnson frowned. "Afraid of me?" "You're not supposed to succeed," Mr. Carter said. "You're not supposed to matter. If you can rise, if you can shine, it proves that all her assumptions were wrong." He paused, letting the words sink in. "People like her. They don't fear your failure. They fear your greatness." Johnson stared at the violin in his lap. Could that really be true? Could he really threaten them? Not by fighting back, but simply by refusing to stay small? The final weekend before the concert arrived like a thunderstorm looming on the horizon. Johnson barely slept. Every muscle in his back screamed in protest. His fingers, once smooth and tender, now bore the rough calluses of relentless practice. Even his mind, usually sharp and agile, felt dulled by the sheer exhaustion of trying to cram months of musical training into a matter of days. But he refused to give up. On Saturday morning, Johnson limped into the music room to find Mr. Carter already waiting, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hand. "You look like you fought a war and lost," Mr. Carter observed dryly. "Feels about right," Johnson said hoarsely, swinging the violin case onto the chair. Mr. Carter gave a rare, approving nod. "Good. You're at the breaking point." "How is that good?" Johnson demanded, half laughing, half crying. "Because," Mr. Carter said, sipping his coffee, "breakthrough usually happens right after the breaking point. You're closer than you think." Their session that day wasn't about scales or finger exercises. It was about emotion, about meaning. "Forget perfect notes," Mr. Carter instructed. "Forget technique. Forget the audience. Play for one person." "Who?" Johnson asked. "That's up to you," Mr. Carter said. "But whoever it is, pour everything you feel into the music." Johnson closed his eyes. Images flooded his mind. His mother, exhausted from endless hospital shifts. His father, frozen forever in that old photograph. Aisha, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, fiercely believing he could do this when he wasn't sure himself. And surprisingly, Principal Stevens, Ms. Reynolds. Every teacher, every student, every system that had tried to reduce him to nothing more than a problem to manage. He raised the violin. He played, not for punishment, not for revenge, but for all the voices inside him that had been silenced for too long. The first notes of meditation shimmered through the empty room, raw and trembling at first, but growing stronger with every measure. Mr. Carter set down his coffee and leaned back, listening. There were still mistakes, the occasional flat note, the uneven phrasing, but beneath it all, the music lived. It breathed, it wept, it soared. When Johnson finished, the final note hanging in the air like a whispered prayer, Mr. Carter exhaled a long breath. "That's it," he said simply. "That's what they can't take from you." Johnson wiped the sweat from his forehead, trembling. "I don't know if it's enough," he admitted. Mr. Carter gave him a fierce look. "It's more than enough." That afternoon, they moved their practice outdoors. Principal Stevens, clearly sensing something was shifting, had forbidden further use of the music rooms under the excuse of spring concert logistics. So Johnson and Mr. Carter met at the old amphitheater in the town park, a crumbling stone stage surrounded by weedy benches and whispering trees. It was there, under a wide blue sky, that Johnson found his rhythm. It was there, as the spring breeze lifted his music into the air, that he forgot the pressure and the fear. It was there that he realized, truly realized, he was no longer playing to survive Principal Stevens' humiliation. He was playing because he loved it. On Sunday evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the last echoes of his violin faded into the dusk, Mr. Carter packed up the music stand and turned to Johnson. "You're ready," he said. Johnson didn't believe it. Not yet. But he wanted to believe it. And sometimes, Mr. Carter had told him, wanting was the first step toward becoming. The evening of the concert arrived heavy with tension. Westridge High School's auditorium had never been so packed. Students, parents, teachers, even members of the local media crammed into every available seat. Whispers swirled through the crowd. Was it true? Could Johnson Williams really play? Was this going to be a train wreck or a miracle? Backstage, Johnson sat alone in a folding chair, his father's violin across his lap, his hands trembling. He could hear the orchestra finishing their final number. Polite applause rising and falling like a tide beyond the heavy velvet curtain. His moment was next. "You ready?" Mr. Carter asked quietly, appearing beside him with a bottle of water. "No," Johnson admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter smiled slightly. "Good. Means you care." The house lights dimmed slightly, signaling the transition. Principal Veronica Stevens swept onto the stage, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. She smiled her practice smile, the one she used when speaking to parents or donors, and stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth as satin, "thank you for attending our annual spring concert. Tonight we have a very unique performance." A ripple of suppressed laughter moved through the audience. "As part of our alternative disciplinary initiative," Principal Stevens continued, "one of our students has been given an opportunity to explore new talents. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Johnson Williams." Polite, skeptical applause. Backstage, Johnson froze. His throat closed, his stomach twisted. "You can do this," Mr. Carter said firmly, placing a steady hand on Johnson's shoulder. "Play for yourself, no one else." Johnson rose on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. He stepped into the spotlight. The sudden brightness blinded him momentarily. The sea of faces beyond the glare blurred into a single, massive presence. His heart hammered against his ribs. He thought of running. He thought of bolting off the stage, violin abandoned, pride shattered. But then he caught sight of his mother, sitting in the third row, still in her hospital scrubs, her face shining with pride and tears. Aisha beside her, grinning fiercely. And further back, Dr. Marcus Williams, sitting calmly with a small smile of encouragement. Johnson inhaled slowly. He positioned the violin under his chin. He closed his eyes, and he began to play. At first, the notes were tentative, trembling on the verge of collapse. A few faces in the audience smirked, ready to laugh. But then the melody began to unfurl. Rich, haunting, undeniable. Massenet's Meditation, delicate and sorrowful and filled with all the emotion Johnson had buried for so long. The auditorium grew silent, dead silent. Every scrape of a shoe, every cough, every whisper faded into absolute stillness. Even Principal Stevens shifted uneasily in her seat, because this wasn't a joke. This wasn't a punishment. This was a performance. Johnson played, pouring every ounce of himself into the music. The humiliation of that first assembly, the sting of Miss Reynolds' cruelty, the pain of long nights practicing with bloody fingertips, the fierce love for a father he barely remembered. Every note was a defiance, every crescendo, a declaration. "I am not who you said I was. I am not what you tried to make me." When he reached the final high note, a shimmering, fragile whisper suspended in air, Johnson let it linger, then gently lowered his bow. For a moment, the auditorium remained frozen. Then the applause exploded like a breaking dam. People leapt to their feet, students, parents, even some teachers. Johnson blinked, overwhelmed. He hadn't failed. He hadn't embarrassed himself. He had triumphed. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Principal Stevens stiffen in her chair, her mouth pressed into a thin, furious line. Johnson smiled slightly. For once, she wasn't in control of the narrative. He was. As he stepped off stage, Mr. Carter grabbed his shoulders. "You did it," the teacher said, eyes shining. "You showed them." Johnson, still breathless, shook his head in disbelief. "No," he whispered. "I showed myself." While the audience erupted in thunderous applause for Johnson, backstage another drama unfolded, quieter but no less consequential. Principal Veronica Stevens stood rigidly near the exit, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Johnson wasn't supposed to succeed. He was supposed to stumble, humiliate himself, validate her warnings about discipline issues and behavioral interventions. Instead, he had captured the entire auditorium with nothing but a violin and sheer undeniable talent. And worse, witnesses were everywhere. The school board members sat wide-eyed and nodding. Dr. Marcus Williams, one of the most respected musical figures in the state, was applauding with a smile of quiet satisfaction. Even several members of the press were here, snapping photos. Principal Stevens forced a smile onto her face and began to weave through the congratulatory crowd. She needed to reclaim the narrative, and fast. Meanwhile, Johnson was mobbed by students and teachers, most of whom had never given him the time of day before tonight. "You were incredible. I had no idea you could even play. Dude, that was better than some pros I've heard." He felt dizzy from the attention. Out of the crowd emerged Aisha, eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she whispered, grabbing his hand. "We did it," Johnson corrected softly, thinking of the countless hours she had spent helping him. Before he could say more, Dr. Williams approached, parting the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. "Young man," Dr. Williams said warmly, shaking Johnson's hand, "you have a rare gift." Johnson flushed under the praise. "Thank you, sir." "I mean it, Doctor," Williams continued. "You have something that can't be taught, something that deserves nurturing, not ridicule." Behind Dr. Williams, Principal Stevens arrived, her smile brittle. "Thank you for attending, Doctor." "Williams," she said, slipping into the conversation, "we at Westridge High are always proud to showcase the hidden talents of our students." Dr. Williams' polite smile never wavered. "Indeed," he said, "though I wonder, had it not been for unconventional circumstances, would young Mr. Williams's talent have ever been discovered?" A flush rose on Principal Stevens' cheeks. "Of course," she said too quickly, "we strive to cultivate all forms of excellence here." Ms. Reynolds, lurking nearby, snorted audibly. Dr. Williams turned his sharp gaze toward her. "And yet," he said softly, "I've heard troubling reports." Johnson stiffened. Was this really happening? Here, now, in front of everyone? Principal Stevens' voice sharpened. "I'm sure any rumors you've heard have been greatly exaggerated." But before she could pivot the conversation, another presence stepped forward. Detective Sarah Chin. Her badge glinted under the overhead lights. "Good evening," she said smoothly. "Principal Stevens, Miss Reynolds. I believe you recognize me." Both women paled. "This is hardly the time," Principal Stevens began. "It's exactly the time," Detective Chin cut her off crisply. She produced a folder. "In light of the recent allegations and corroborating evidence, you are both being placed under formal investigation for misconduct." A gasp rippled through the nearby crowd. Students, parents, teachers, all watching, all listening. Ms. Reynolds blanched, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Principal Stevens, ever the politician, drew herself up. "This is absurd. I have always acted in the best interests of this school." "Perhaps," Detective Chin said coolly, "the school board will decide. But until then, you are suspended effective immediately." The audience, realizing something major was unfolding, grew restless. Whispers escalated into murmurs. Phone cameras began to rise. Principal Stevens glared at Johnson as if this humiliation were somehow his fault. But Johnson met her gaze evenly, without fear. For once, it was she who stood exposed. No veil of authority, no armor of titles. Just a person caught abusing power and facing consequences. Dr. Williams leaned closer to Johnson. "You fought back the right way," he murmured, "with truth, with grace." Johnson swallowed hard, emotions swirling inside him. Gratitude, relief, and something stronger. A deep, unshakable sense of his own worth. As Detective Chin led Principal Stevens and Miss Reynolds toward the exit, the entire auditorium watched. Some clapped, some jeered, most simply stared. The spell of unquestioned authority finally broken. Aisha slid her hand into Johnson's and squeezed. "You didn't just change your story," she whispered. "You changed everything." And Johnson realized she was right. Tonight wasn't just about playing the violin. It was about reclaiming his dignity. It was about forcing the world to see what had been ignored, dismissed, underestimated. It was about taking back the narrative from those who had tried to write him into oblivion. And for the first time, Johnson wasn't just surviving, he was soaring. In the weeks following the concert, Westridge High School underwent a transformation so profound, it felt almost surreal to Johnson. Gone was the quiet resignation that had filled the halls, the sense that injustice was inevitable and unchangeable. In its place was a new energy, a new vigilance. The first change was swift. Dr. Eleanor Gaines was appointed the permanent principal. Her first address to the students was clear and uncompromising. "This school will no longer tolerate abuses of power," she said, her voice echoing across the packed auditorium. "Every student deserves respect, opportunity, and safety." Johnson sat in the front row beside Aisha, feeling a mixture of disbelief and hope. In the months that followed, a new anti-discrimination policy was implemented. Mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, a zero-tolerance policy for physical punishment, an anonymous reporting system that allowed students to safely voice concerns. Teachers who once looked past microaggressions now stepped in immediately. Students who had once been afraid to speak up found their voices. And Johnson, he became a symbol. Not because he wanted to, not because he asked to, but because his story, a story that had begun with humiliation, had lit a fire no one could ignore. Yet fame sat uneasily on Johnson's shoulders. He wasn't used to being noticed, much less celebrated. The Tribune's article, "Hidden Talent: How a Disciplinary Action Revealed a Musical Prodigy," had gone viral far beyond the town. Journalists requested interviews. Music programs sent scholarship offers. Even the Eastman School of Music formally invited Johnson to join their summer preparatory program on a full scholarship. At first, Johnson hesitated. Part of him still clung to the fear, the small, quiet voice whispering, "You don't belong. You're not good enough." But then he remembered standing alone on that stage, violin under his chin, a thousand silent doubts transformed into soaring music. He had proven to himself most of all that he did belong. One afternoon, as he packed his books after school, Mr. Carter approached him with a wide smile. "I have some news," the music teacher said, excitement dancing in his eyes. "You've been invited to perform at the State Arts Showcase next spring." Johnson blinked. "Me?" "You," Mr. Carter said, clapping him on the back. "Your performance at Eastman caught a lot of important people's attention. They want you to represent emerging youth talent." Johnson's hands trembled slightly. The showcase was a statewide event, an honor reserved for the best young artists in every discipline. "But I'm still learning," Johnson protested weakly. "So is every great musician," Mr. Carter replied. "Learning never stops." Johnson looked down at his father's violin, the gift that had once been pawned, then returned by fate to the son who never knew its story. He tightened his grip. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "Good," Mr. Carter said, his voice thick with pride. "You're not just representing yourself anymore. You're representing everyone who's ever been told they weren't good enough." At home that evening, Johnson shared the news with his mother. She cried, not tears of sorrow this time, but of pride and bittersweet joy. "He would be so proud of you," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "Daddy?" Johnson said softly. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking. "He sacrificed everything so you'd have a chance to dream." Johnson spent the summer immersed in music, classes, master classes, one-on-one sessions with top violinists. Every day was a new challenge, stretching his abilities beyond anything he thought possible. There were hard days, days when frustration gnawed at him, days when the physical pain in his back returned to haunt him. But there were also moments of pure transcendence, when the music flowed through him effortlessly, when the violin felt like an extension of his soul. On the last night of the summer program, after a final recital, Dr. Marcus Williams found Johnson backstage. "You have a decision to make, Doctor," Williams said. "You're talented enough to pursue music professionally, if that's what you want." Johnson hesitated. He thought of everything, the path he had been forced onto by cruelty, the unexpected doorways that had opened, the dreams that had begun to take shape. "I don't know if I'm ready," Johnson admitted. No one ever feels ready, Dr. Williams said with a chuckle. But you are, and you don't have to decide now. Music will wait for you if it's truly yours. That night, Johnson sat by the window of his dorm room, gazing out at the quiet Eastman campus. The violin rested on his lap, the wood warm under his fingers. He drew the bow across the strings, not performing for anyone, not proving anything, just playing, for himself, for his father, for the boy who had once stood trembling at a school assembly, forced to hold a violin as a punishment, only to discover a destiny he never knew he carried. As the notes filled the night, Johnson understood something simple and profound. Sometimes the obstacles thrown in your path are not meant to stop you. They are meant to reveal you to yourself and to the world. And in that revelation, a new dream is born. One that no humiliation, no injustice, no cruelty can ever take away. Not again. Not ever. The day of the State Arts Showcase arrived like a slow-building storm, heavy with expectation, electrified with possibility. As Johnson stood backstage at the Grand Civic Auditorium, the largest venue he had ever entered, he marveled at how far he had come in such a short time. Only a few months earlier, he had been a target for humiliation, a boy forced onto a stage with a violin meant to mock him. Now he stood here, invited, celebrated, and ready. He wasn't without fear, but it was no longer the fear of failure. It was the awe of stepping fully into a destiny he never could have imagined. Mr. Carter and Dr. Marcus Williams stood nearby, offering last-minute encouragements. "You've already won," Mr. Carter said with quiet certainty. "Tonight isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about sharing the gift that was hidden inside you all along." Johnson nodded, gripping his father's violin tighter. He thought of the journey, the broken chair, the bruises, the stolen dignity, and how every cruel attempt to crush him had paradoxically refined him into something stronger. He thought of his mother, who had worked endless shifts, yet still found time to clean his wounds and lift his spirit. He thought of Aisha, who had stayed up late helping him practice and cheered for him louder than anyone else. And he thought of his father, who had once cradled this very violin in hands worn by sacrifice, dreaming silent dreams he never got to fulfill. Tonight is for all of them. When Johnson stepped onto the stage, the auditorium lights softened around him. He could barely make out the crowd beyond the first few rows, a sea of faces, a blur of expectation. But he wasn't playing for them. He raised the violin to his shoulder, closed his eyes, and began. The first notes of Meditation by Massenet drifted through the hall, sweet and aching, carrying with them the weight of a boy's sorrow, a father's sacrifice, a mother's fierce love. As the music soared, Johnson lost all sense of the stage, the audience, even his own body. There was only the music, pure, unfiltered, and alive. When the final note faded into silence, the hall remained still for a breathless moment. Then came the applause, a thunderous standing ovation that shook the rafters. Johnson opened his eyes, blinking against the stage lights, and saw row after row of people on their feet. In the front row, Dr. Williams was applauding with tears in his eyes. Beside him, Mr. Carter stood tall and proud, and in the center his mother, her face radiant with emotion, her hands clapping fiercely, as if trying to will her son's dreams even higher. Aisha whistled and cheered, making Johnson laugh through the tears welling in his eyes. Later that night, as he sat with Mr. Carter and Dr. Williams backstage, Johnson received an offer that would once have seemed unimaginable. A full scholarship to the Eastman Preparatory Division for the next academic year. Room, board, private lessons, a path forward, a future unshackled by the low expectations others had once chained around his neck. "You earned this, Doctor," Williams said, "not because of what happened to you, but because of how you chose to rise above it." Johnson nodded, humbled and overwhelmed. "I won't waste it," he promised. "We know you won't," Mr. Carter replied. As Johnson left the auditorium that night, his father's violin cradled in his arms, he understood a truth deeper than any lesson he had learned in school. Adversity had not broken him, it had revealed him. And every scar, every humiliation, every moment of doubt had been the hammer and chisel, carving him into the person he was always meant to become. As the night air wrapped around him, Johnson lifted his face to the stars. He was no longer the boy forced to perform as punishment. He was the young man who had turned cruelty into art, injustice into opportunity, pain into music, and humiliation into triumph. Dear friends, Johnson's story reminds us that the most extraordinary talents often hide behind the quietest faces, and that sometimes life's cruelest challenges are the very forge that creates brilliance. Every child, regardless of background, race, or circumstance, deserves a chance to discover their gifts without fear of humiliation or injustice. When we nurture hidden potential instead of trying to crush it, when we listen instead of judging, when we open doors instead of slamming them shut, we don't just change one life, we change the future for generations to come. If this story touched your heart, please like this video to help it reach others who need to hear this message of resilience and hidden genius. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories celebrating courage, hidden talents, and the unstoppable power of hope. Together, we can create a world where every child is seen, heard, and valued, not for what others expect of them, but for the incredible light they carry within. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never underestimate the quiet ones. They are often the ones who change the world.